Racist cop attacks. Black man in court. Turns pale when she learns his true identity. The night was quiet in downtown Nashville, Tennessee, the kind of stillness that made every small sound feel louder. Lieutenant Karen Dobbs sat in her patrol car, watching from the corner of West End Avenue. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, just keeping an eye on things. That's what she told herself, at least. Then she saw him, a tall black man, dressed in a dark tailored suit, walking along the sidewalk near a high-end boutique. Something about him made her pay attention. Maybe it was the way he moved, not in a rush, not hesitant, just sure of himself. She didn't like that. She flicked on her headlights and rolled the car forward. As she pulled up beside him, she leaned out the window. "You live around here?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of suspicion. The man turned his head slightly, meeting her eyes. "Excuse me?" His tone was even. Not defensive, not hostile, just calm. Karen didn't like that either. "It's a simple question." She stepped out of the car. "You match the description of a suspect we're looking for." That wasn't true, but it was all the justification she needed. The man sighed, slow and deliberate. "I'd like to know what description that is." Karen squared her shoulders. "Dark suit, tall, walking in an area that's had recent break-ins." She saw the flicker in his eyes. Not fear, but something else. Annoyance, disbelief. "I see," he said. "Well, I'd be happy to clarify anything. Do you have probable cause to detain me?" Karen clenched her jaw. His tone, too composed, too measured, got under her skin. She was used to people backing down, making excuses, fumbling over their words. He wasn't. "Let's see some ID." The man hesitated. Not because he didn't have it, but because he knew exactly where this was going. And he was right. Before he could reach into his pocket, Karen took a step forward. "Hands where I can see them." He exhaled, clearly frustrated now. "Officer, this is unnecessary." "Turn around." His shoulders tensed. "Are you arresting me?" "Turn around." He did, slowly, carefully, like a man who had been through this before. She cuffed him, and just like that, it was done. But something felt off. No arguments, no shouting, no threats of a lawsuit, just quiet compliance, like a man who knew this was only the beginning. She didn't realize how right he was. But she was about to find out. The hum of voices in Davidson County Courthouse filled the air as Lieutenant Karen Dobbs adjusted her uniform, rolling her shoulders back. She had done this before. Stood in front of a judge, given her account, walked out without a second thought. This was just another day, another suspect, another open and shut case. Except it wasn't. Across the room, Terence Lawson sat at the defense table, his posture relaxed, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He didn't look rattled, didn't look like a man on trial. That annoyed her. Karen kept her expression neutral as she took the stand, waiting for the prosecutor to begin. A middle-aged man with thinning hair and a crisp navy suit, he gave her a polite nod before stepping forward. "Lieutenant Dobbs, can you walk us through the night of the arrest?" She cleared her throat. "I was on patrol around 10:30 p.m. I noticed the defendant acting suspiciously near several businesses that had reported recent break-ins." The prosecutor nodded. "And what led you to detain him?" "His behavior. He appeared to be surveying the area, taking his time near closed storefronts. I initiated contact, asked for ID, and he refused to comply." Terence didn't react. He just watched. The defense attorney, a sharp-looking woman in her late 40s, adjusted her glasses and stood up. "Lieutenant Dobbs," she began, flipping through a folder. "Are you familiar with the Fourth Amendment?" Karen felt irritation creep up her neck. "Of course." "Good. Then you understand that an officer needs reasonable suspicion to detain someone. Can you specify what Mr. Lawson was doing that made him a suspect?" Karen stiffened. "As I said, he was loitering near a high-end shopping area late at night." The defense attorney raised an eyebrow. "Loitering? Would you say walking is a crime?" Karen exhaled slowly. "It depends on the circumstances." "Right. So let's clarify those circumstances. Did you witness Mr. Lawson attempt to enter any closed businesses?" "No, but..." Did he run, hide, display any behavior that suggested criminal intent? Karen hesitated. Lieutenant? No. The defense attorney took a slow step forward, letting the silence settle. Then tell me this. How many people walked down that street that night? Karen blinked. I don't have that number. Did you stop all of them? No, but… Just him? Karen felt the shift in the room, the quiet, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Her grip tightened on the edge of the witness stand. The defense attorney didn't press further, not yet. She simply glanced at Terence, then back at the judge. No further questions, Your Honor, for now. Karen swallowed. This wasn't going the way she expected, and something told her it was about to get worse, but she had no idea just how bad it was going to be. Karen sat stiffly in the witness chair, her palms pressing into her lap. She was used to courtroom procedures, but this wasn't how things were supposed to go. The defense attorney, Victoria Hayes, had already poked holes in her testimony, and now, as she stood again, flipping through her folder with a quiet confidence, Karen braced herself. Lieutenant Dobbs, Victoria said, adjusting her glasses. Let's talk about what happened after you detained Mr. Lawson. You placed him under arrest without incident? Karen nodded. Yes. And then you transported him to the precinct? Correct. Victoria walked slowly toward the defense table, lifting a document. According to your report, you charged him with obstruction of justice and resisting arrest. She turned her sharp gaze toward Karen. But you just testified that he complied. How exactly did he resist? Karen's mouth went dry. He refused to show ID. Victoria arched a brow. Is that a crime? Karen hesitated. It can be, if an individual is suspected of unlawful activity. Suspected? Based on what? Karen clenched her jaw. His behavior. Victoria sighed, setting the document down. You keep saying that, Lieutenant. But let's examine the facts. You had no description of a suspect that matched him. You didn't see him commit a crime. You didn't even witness anything close to illegal behavior. And yet, you arrested him. She let the words hang for a second before adding, Did you ever stop to consider that he might have just been a man walking home? Karen felt the heat rising in her chest. I did what any officer would do in my position. Victoria didn't blink. Would you have done the same if he were white? A ripple went through the courtroom. Someone coughed. The judge gave a warning glance, but the tension was already thick in the air. Karen forced herself to keep her face neutral. Race had nothing to do with it. Victoria nodded, as if she expected that answer. Let's move on. You ran his name through the system after his arrest, correct? Karen hesitated. Yes. Victoria held up another paper. Did you find anything? Karen exhaled. No. No warrants, no priors. Karen shook her head. Nothing. Victoria let that settle before stepping closer. So, to recap, an innocent man with no criminal record, who wasn't breaking any laws, was arrested simply because you thought he looked suspicious. Karen clenched her jaw. I stand by my decision. Victoria didn't argue. She just turned to the jury. That's all, Your Honor. Karen exhaled as the judge called for a recess. She stood, straightening her uniform, and made her way toward the hallway. But the moment she stepped outside, she saw something that made her stomach tighten. Across the corridor, Terence Lawson was shaking hands with a court clerk, who then leaned in and whispered something to Victoria. Karen's pulse quickened. She didn't know what was going on, but whatever it was about to change everything. Karen's fingers curled into her lap as Terence Lawson stood, adjusting the cuffs of his suit. The quiet confidence in his posture sent a ripple through the courtroom. Not just because of the way he moved, but because he wasn't acting like a man fighting for his innocence. He was acting like a man who already won. The judge looked up from the folder, her expression unreadable. Mr. Lawson, you may proceed. Karen stiffened. Since when did defendants get to proceed? Terence stepped forward, his voice steady. Your Honor, I've remained silent throughout most of these proceedings, allowing my counsel to present my case. But I believe it's time I speak for myself. Karen felt her stomach tighten. He's too calm, too controlled. Go ahead, the judge said. Terence turned, his gaze landing on her. Lieutenant Dobbs, he said evenly, do you remember the night of my arrest? Karen's mouth felt dry, but she forced herself to nod. Of course. And you testified, under oath, that you stopped me because I appeared suspicious, that I was loitering in a wealthy area, that you were acting in the best interest of public safety. She sat up straighter. That's correct. A small, knowing smile played at the corner of his lips. Interesting. Karen clenched her jaw. Terence turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to formally introduce myself. A hush fell over the room. My name is Special Agent Terence Lawson. Karen's heart stopped. I am a federal investigator with the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. For the past 7 months, I have been working undercover to identify patterns of unlawful policing, specifically targeting cases of racial profiling and false arrests. Karen felt her breath leave her lungs. She barely registered the collective murmur sweeping through the courtroom. The prosecutor turned to her, his face pale. Terence reached into his jacket, pulling out a Department of Justice badge, holding it up for the judge to see. This case was never about me being a suspect. It was about me being a target. Karen's vision tunneled. No. This wasn't happening. The judge nodded slowly. I've reviewed the documents presented by Mr. Lawson's team. It appears this arrest was not only unjustified, but part of a larger pattern of misconduct. She turned to Karen. Lieutenant Dobbs, do you have anything to say for yourself? Karen swallowed hard. Words failed her. Everything she thought she knew, about her case, about her authority, about how much control she had in that courtroom, had just shattered. The defense attorney folded her arms. We'll be filing a formal motion to dismiss all charges, effective immediately. The judge nodded. Motion granted. Karen could barely process what was happening as the gavel came down. But the worst was yet to come. Because Terence Lawson wasn't finished. And what he was about to say next would make her regret ever putting those handcuffs on him. Karen sat frozen. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, but all she could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat. Special agent. She had arrested a federal agent under false pretenses. Not just any agent. One investigating cops like her. Her. Terence remained standing, his badge still in hand, but his eyes were locked on her now. Lieutenant Dobbs, he said, his voice smooth, deliberate. Would you like to know why I was in that neighborhood that night? Karen swallowed, but her throat felt like sandpaper. He didn't wait for an answer. I was there following a lead. On corrupt policing. He let the words sink in before continuing. We'd been receiving complaints about an officer in this district. Unlawful stops. Racial profiling. False reports. Karen's pulse hammered in her ears. So, I went out that night. Alone. No wires, no backup. Just me. He tilted his head slightly. To see if the stories were true. Karen could barely breathe. Terence turned toward the judge. And within minutes of my arrival I was stopped and detained, without cause. He looked back at her. By you. The weight of it crashed over her. This was never a routine arrest. She had walked right into a setup, and she hadn't even known. The judge exhaled. Agent Lawson, given the severity of what's been presented here, I assume the DOJ will be taking further action. Karen's hands curled into fists under the table. Terence gave a slow nod. Yes, Your Honor. The Department of Justice will be conducting a full review of Lieutenant Dobbs's cases, as well as the department's handling of civilian interactions. Karen's breath hitched. A full review. That meant every stop she had made, every arrest, every report. Everything she had ever done in uniform was about to be picked apart. She gritted her teeth. This wasn't fair. She was just doing her job. The judge nodded solemnly. Then this court will cooperate with any federal investigation as needed. Terence finally sat down. The tension in the air didn't lift. Karen's mind whirled. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She was the cop. He was supposed to be the criminal. But today, the badge on her chest didn't mean power. It meant scrutiny. And soon, it might not be hers to wear at all. But the worst part? She wasn't sure she could even argue that she didn't deserve it. Karen's hands felt clammy against the polished wood of the table. The courtroom had quieted, but the weight of what had just unfolded pressed down on her like a vice. She had spent years believing in her own authority, convinced that her instincts were always right, that she could tell who was trouble and who wasn't, that she could justify any decision she made in the name of public safety. But today, she had been the one on trial. The judge glanced at her one last time before standing. This concludes today's proceedings. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down. A sharp, final sound. Karen didn't move. For the first time in her career, she didn't know where she stood. The courtroom slowly emptied, but Terence Lawson remained seated, watching her. Not with anger, not with satisfaction. With something else. Disappointment. That stung more than anything. As he stood, he slid his DOJ badge back into his jacket and buttoned it smoothly. It didn't have to be this way, Lieutenant. Karen swallowed, but she had no words. Terence shook his head slightly. You don't even realize what you've done, do you? She bristled. I was doing my job. He let out a short breath. No. You were doing what you thought you could get away with. Karen clenched her jaw. How many others? Terence asked. She froze. How many people have you done this to? Her mouth opened, then closed. She didn't have an answer, and that silence was answer enough. Terence studied her for a long moment, then simply shook his head and walked toward the exit. The defense team followed. The judge disappeared into chambers. Even the prosecutor, who had been seated beside Karen all trial, quickly packed up his things and left without a word. Karen was alone. She exhaled slowly and finally pushed herself up from her chair. But as she moved toward the door, she caught sight of her reflection in the glass panel. For the first time in her life, she wasn't sure she recognized the person staring back. All these years she thought she had control. She thought she was the one deciding who belonged and who didn't. But now, she wasn't in control of anything. And that terrified her. Because for the first time, she saw herself the way others had always seen her, not as the hero, not as the protector, but as the problem. And the worst part? She had no one to blame but herself. Don't be like her. Power isn't a shield against accountability. If you stay silent when you see injustice, you're part of the problem. Speak up, pay attention, and never assume that authority makes someone right. If you found this story thought-provoking, subscribe for more.